oftentimes these become very complicated as to what is the relationship between all the parties.
What distinguishes a trucking case from a motor vehicle accident case? We're going to talk to attorney David Sargent about that on today's Ask the Lawyer. David, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So first up, what is the standard of care required generally in any vehicle crash?
In any vehicle crash, it's negligence, and that applies across the country as well as in Colorado. Negligence really is looking at the reasonableness of the driving or actions for those in the crash. And you look at a standard of care that an ordinary person of reasonable prudence would use under the same or similar circumstances. So in a motor vehicle crash or a trucking crash, we look at whether there was a duty to drive in a reasonable way, whether there was a violation of that caused the crash and consequently the injuries. An example would be, say, running a red light. There's a rule against running red lights. We do that for safety. When a driver runs a red light and causes an accident, causing injuries, we look at negligence as the kind of claim that we would use to establish why there should be compensation for the injured person.
So that example you give of running a red light, it kind of sounds like the rules that we all have to follow as just your typical drivers. Are there any specific to trucking cases?
There are. Trucking cases are different from motor vehicle accident cases because trucks are huge. They can weigh upwards of 100,000 pounds easily, 20 to 30 times the weight of your average car. They sit higher. They have undercarriages, which can suck cars in. They can really, really create painful and terrific injuries if a collision occurs. As a result, unlike your average driver, commercial trucking companies and their drivers have to follow additional rules, not the ones that, in addition to the ones that we have to follow on the road as ordinary drivers. They have the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act, and that lays out a whole bunch of protocols and rules that they have to follow to ensure that the drivers and the commercial trucks on the road are not going to pose a danger to the general public. From that, the drivers have to be trained. They have commercial driver's licenses, and it's almost the same state to state throughout the entire country. And that provides the substantive rules and standards that they have to follow. The commercial trucking companies, often called motor carriers, have an obligation to train those drivers and to supervise those drivers in best practices for commercial trucking. So when you take these additional rules, the standard of negligence stays the same, but they have to use a whole bunch of different rules in addition to the other common rules that the average driver has to follow.
So as average drivers, can we look to the rules that we know to try to determine if a truck driver should have driven in a particular way?
Oh, a great question. And it's not always clear. Commercial truck drivers are held to the same standard of a duty of care, like we talked about negligence, but they have, because of their knowledge and their training and their skill, additional duties that they must follow. Some of them are not always clear. And so if it's a common red light violation, to go back to our first example, then we would know. But if it's perhaps because they have violated their hours of duty, or they haven't taken a right turn in the appropriate way, or perhaps they took a left turn when they really should not have, then we might have some breaches of the obligation to drive safely that we wouldn't necessarily recognize. In fact, less than 1% of law enforcement is able to do an investigation because they're just not trained in commercial trucking collision cases.
So when looking at these cases, what does this chain of companies look like?
The chain of companies or transportation cycle is the big process of how goods are shipped from one part of from one place to another. Typically, it starts with a shipper, and the shipper oftentimes has its regular motor carriers or trucking companies. Oftentimes, they use a broker that finds motor carriers, and then those motor carriers or trucking companies have employee drivers, or they find their drivers, and then they deliver the goods from the shipper through those drivers to an end recipient. Oftentimes, insurance companies are part of this very transportation cycle. And so there are a lot of different entities and pieces to the big distribution. Another component of it is who owns the truck, who owns the trailer. And oftentimes these become very complicated as to what is the relationship between all the parties.
So when you're looking at gathering evidence in these truck cases, how does that differ from just your typical car crash case?
Well, like I said earlier, there's very few law enforcement officers are trained on what to look for. And the first thing that one would want to look for is a bill of lading, because that describes who's involved. Who is the shipper? Who is the broker, the trucking company? And who is the recipient? And who's taking on which obligations? The bill of lading can be secured afterwards, but oftentimes after a trucking wreck, we're just left with the trucking company. What is given to the officer, because the officers ask for driver's license, registration. They maybe note that there's a US DOT number on the truck, and that's about it. The trucking companies have an obligation, and the drivers have an obligation to make sure it's installed on modern trucks. Cameras in the cab, cameras that can capture what happened in the incident. There are also other kinds of electronic data, like sensors that can figure out what the force of impact is. There's also GPS data. Some of this you would find in regular car crash cases. A lot of it is specific and federally regulated, if not state regulated, for trucking companies.
David, thanks for taking the time to talk with us today.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
And that's going to do it for this episode of Ask the Lawyer. My guest has been David Sargent. If you want to ask him about your situation, call the number on the screen. Thanks for watching. I'm Molly Hendrickson for Ask the Lawyers.